Welcome to a Mackenzie Institute Long Talk. It's said that a crisis is also a communication crisis. Why? Well, just when you need information the most and it has to be accurate, disseminated quickly to multiple stakeholders, that's just the time that you don't have it. You're in a crisis. Well, I've come to the University of Regina to discuss just that topic with Dale Edward Johnson. Now, why him? He's a former journalist, but a lot of people in PR and communication are. He's worked at the network and local levels in radio, TV, and in print. He's published 1,000 articles. He's a published author. But he's also written speeches for a CEO full-time for 7 years. Lots of people write speeches, but very few people do it full-time. And even fewer ever do it for multiple years like that. Dale has also been teaching PR and communication both in the classroom and online at the University of Regina for many years. So let's go to Dale Edward Johnson and find his perspective on crisis communication. Well, let's start with the good old-fashioned press release. Sometime in a crisis, an organization is going to have to tell somebody what went wrong, maybe tell people through the media. What's your advice about a press release?
Well, still a very important tool for communications because the press release still has the 5 W's: who, where, when, what, why. And that's what reporters want. So the press release or news release is still crucial in all sorts of communications. Of course, in crisis, it all has to happen so much quicker.
Now, what about when you don't know much? I mean, that's kind of the definition of a crisis. What do you write about?
Well, you write with what you do know about. You would know approximately when something happened. And even if you have to generalize and say it happened recently or happened overnight, if you don't know that it happened at 3:18 a.m., say it happened overnight. Go with what you've got because reporters are going to want some information no matter what you've got. The same with, you probably know where, the location. And as you go through the 5 W's, tell as much as you can tell.
In 2 Canadian cities recently, emergency responders and industry have been criticized for being really slow in getting information out to the media. My guess is they were waiting for perfect information, but what's your advice on how soon is soon enough to start communicating about an earthquake, a tornado, an industrial accident, that sort of thing?
Right away, because that's the very essence of crisis communications, is to get it out right away. And more details will follow, and people understand that more will come out later, but go with what you've got, because the media will be going with what they have. And if you're not providing information, they're going to go with other information, no matter how unreliable or inaccurate it may be. They're not going to stop doing the news because they haven't got a press release yet, especially true in the 24-hour news cycle.
Now, social media, though, has also caused people to focus attention on tweeting, and people are aware that Mayor Nenshi in Calgary got elected by being a voluminous tweeter. Where does social media fit into good old-fashioned communication with radio, TV, print?
Well, sometimes there's a question about the credibility of social media. So if it's accurate information, depending on the source, then it's of course valuable. But very often it's not as accurate as we normally see in a news release. But certainly it has its role because it can get information out quicker than a lot of other methods.
Well, the official responders can make sure their information's accurate on social media. It's other social media users who may retweet things that are inaccurate, right?
And that's why, absolutely, and that's why it's so important to monitor social media, especially in a time of crisis, to make sure what's going out is correct and to update it and correct it if there's something out there that needs to be corrected.
Let's take an industrial accident at a refinery which happened in St. John, New Brunswick. How soon is soon enough to notify citizens that you're either looking into it or you know what's in the air or you don't know what's in the air? I mean, how soon should be the first announcement?
I would think moments. I think it should be measured in minutes because that's how long it's going to take for someone to pick up the telephone and call the 24-hour news station and say, there's an explosion here. What's happened? We can only imagine. So that's why it's so important to get out right away because otherwise the public will be talking about it, the media will be talking about it, and reporters will be on the scene. So you better have some information.
All right, so that's information for all media, social media, radio, TV, print, everybody, blogs, what have you. Let's thin slice that a little. you're in an event like this. Do you play favorites, radio, TV, print, magazines? Do you try to treat everybody the same? How would you change your approach to different media?
Well, radio is a lot more immediate than others. So I would say at a time of crisis, the first priority should be to contact radio stations who will probably be broadcasting it anyways. So that would be the first priority. Then probably television, because it's coming up to their deadline, either 6 o'clock or 10 o'clock in the evening or 10:30, and of course morning news. It also depends what time of day, because if it happens first thing in the morning, there are going to be live television shows in a lot of cities from 6 till 9 in the morning. You'd want to reach out to them as quickly as you would want to reach out to radio. Newspapers also may want more details and more depth. And even though newspapers still have the printing press's role for the first edition, however, newspapers also update their websites moment by moment. So more so in the past, it's probably important to contact all media right away, but I would say radio first of all.
Well, I was just going to say that the new thing since you were a journalist is that all media are trying to become all media, or actually are all media. So radio stations have websites with text and pictures and video. Television stations have text and audio, and newspapers have video and audio. So isn't everybody, and you've got to disseminate all types of communication instantly?
Absolutely, and there is sort of a convergence of all of these. I mean, not that many years ago, a radio station would not have a photographer, and a newspaper would not run audio clips of a news conference, and now they may. They may do the story about what was said at a news conference or an announcement, but they may also run it raw. So there might be a 5 or 10 or 20-minute raw interview on the newspaper website. For more details, go here.
Now, when in doubt, the average emergency responder should also know where those media outlets are physically. What's your advice about going and knocking on the door if maybe there's a power failure or there's some other impediment to normal ways of communication?
Very important, and it's all about building relationships, and that's why it's important to do that sort of thing before the crisis instead of waiting for the crisis and then trying to find out where these places are located. If you know beforehand, as a courtesy call, almost as a social call, in the professional sense, is to know where these places are, and then when something comes up, you're able to react a lot quicker and know where to go.
Now, somewhere in the evolution of this hypothetical crisis we're speaking of, someone is going to have to make a speech or presentation. It's going to be the Board of Trade or the Chamber of Commerce. It's going to be a legislative or regulatory committee. It's going to be the Legislation and Licensing Committee. But somebody is going to want to hear about this from somebody. What's your advice about writing that statement?
I guess really you're going to be so close to it, you may be tempted to go into far more detail than they may want to know. So think of the very high-level approach of and again, answer those 5 W's. Provide background and try to provide some context depending how much time has passed since the event. But try to provide some context of where your organization is in the community, how many times these events may have happened, how this compares to other local or national events. So a lot of it, with a bit of time, you have a chance to provide some context of what this all means.
But surely the technically knowledgeable CEOs that you've written for are really tempted to put in their technical knowledge and maybe even confuse people. How do you talk them out of that?
I always say, keep in mind that you're in the lineup at the grocery store and someone notices the name tag on your briefcase and says, well, what do you do at that place? How would you explain it to them? Or the very bright 14-year-old neighbor kid who pokes his or her head over the fence and says, hey, what do you do at your job? What's new and interesting? How would you explain it to that person? That's probably the correct approach to explain it to a business crowd.
How about rehearsing and causing the CEO to practice? I mean, many of these folks think they're already pretty good at what they do, and they got there by being pretty good. How do you convince them that now's the time to put a little more rehearsal into it?
Well, a lot of them say they don't have time. People are busy. They don't have time to practice and rehearse. But as I say, the best people who give speeches, they practice. When our Prime Minister, when our politicians are giving speeches, they will practice. The Rolling Stones have been playing music for a long time. They still practice. Professional athletes, the top 0.1% in North America, they spend more time practicing than playing. So in order to be successful in giving a presentation, practice is essential.
A lot of times in an emergency plan, city emergency plan, or a private sector crisis management plan, I see a job description, and it is for an information officer to write press releases, inform media, call press conferences, monitor media, brief government contacts, and about halfway through this list, I think this is just too much for one person to do in any sort of a timely fashion. Give us an idea how long it takes to do the traditional functions in communication during a crisis.
Everything has to be speeded up. They're really the same functions, but everything has to be done. Things that normally would take a week or a month has to be done in an hour or a day. So you have to find shortcuts and perhaps fewer reviews and double checking and that sort of thing, editing. Having said that, though, it's still got to be accurate, and you still have to answer those 5 W's. So it's just that everything has to be done quicker in the time of crisis.
Well, how do you speed things up? It takes a certain amount of time. Do you get more people, or do you have fewer checks and balances, or
fewer checks and balances, and also more people can help. You can pull in people from, depending on the organization, from other parts of the team who may be able to help. If it's a matter of finding out some factual historic information, there may be someone in another department not in communication that you could say, can you give us a list of how many branches we've had over the past 50 years and how that number has changed? Maybe somebody from accounting could track that down. So yes, call in other people, and that's one of the best ways. If it's a larger group, a larger communications team, it may be 1 person or 20 people in a communications team. If it's 20 people or 10 people, you can divide the work up, and that's the way it's accomplished. But again, it's better if you have had some sort of practice run of how would we handle a crisis through a scenario. And if you do a little practicing ahead of time, then when the real thing happens, you're going to say, oh, well, you handle the radio, for example, you look after the television, you look after logistics, and you look after the historic context, or however you want to divide it up. But yeah, a lot of it is dividing things up so that everybody knows their responsibilities.
Okay, just for fun, biggest mistakes you see people making in media relations, whether it's in or out of a crisis?
I would say spending too much time getting too detailed. They should look at the big picture thing, and wasting time to try to figure out if the anniversary date was actually January 28th or January 29th, and you could spend a lot of time figuring out some factoid like that, which in the overall context, it may be very important within the organization, but in the context of the media release, perhaps the important thing is that the organization celebrated an anniversary in January rather than the particular date. So sometimes getting bogged down in details can be a big problem.
Do you advocate getting all this information together and maybe even harnessing some of these other workers in the organization just in case? Do you advocate doing that long before a crisis?
Absolutely. That's very important. You got to plan for the unexpected. You can't just let it happen. I've worked in communication shops of varying sizes, from 1 person to about 20. And I know when I was flying solo, I had thought if we had a crisis, I thought of people in other organizations, related organizations. This was a government body, so I knew there were other people in other government agencies who I had relationships with, and they would be the people I would call in if I knew this is by far more than work for 1 person. This needs more hands. I knew who I could contact, and I talked to them about it, and that was sort of the unofficial backup plan. But if it had happened, we would have been ready.
Any final bits of advice?
I think really the other thing is to understand reporters and try to think of what they're trying to do from their perspective. Put yourself in their shoes. You've got your concerns about this crisis. They've got their concerns of coming up with an item for the 6 o'clock news or the morning newscast or a column. So they've also got a boss, they've also got deadlines, and they're trying to do their job. So I would say try to keep that in mind, which can be difficult in a time of crisis because you are understandably preoccupied with your own concern. But think of the reporters, think of the people, the other side of things too.
Interesting. Thanks.
You're most welcome.
Any views expressed here are not necessarily those of the Mackenzie Institute, its speakers, sponsors, or supporters. But the Institute is dedicated to fostering public discussion, debate, and education about security matters. Google the Mackenzie Institute to join the discussion. The Mackenzie Institute is grateful to its sponsors and supporters. Some of our short pods and long talks are a result of the support of Heathbridge Capital Management Limited, the National Post, and Dundurn Publishing.